Story 1. Had the Central Intelligence Agency shared intelligence with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the outcome might have been different. There are many examples, but on August 23, the Mossad, Israel's Institute for Intelligence and Special Operations, gave the Central Intelligence Agency the names of the 19 hijackers and warned that they were in the United States and planning an attack. If you are interested in this, read The Looming Tower, one of the best nonfiction books ever written. It details the intelligence failures that allowed the September 11th attacks to happen. Story 2. Well, if the Wright brothers hadn't invented the airplane, that would have helped. Story 3. There should have been better communication between intelligence agencies. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency had intelligence all along but never connected it properly. Story 4. If the Ottoman Empire had not collapsed, the attacks of September 11th, 2001 probably would not have occurred. Story 5. Before September 11th, 2001, pilots were trained to believe that suicide was unlikely to be the intent of a hijacker. The prevailing view at that time was that cooperating with hijackers gave everyone the best chance to survive. Although there was historical precedent indicating this could be a misguided assumption, suicide hijackings were statistically rare even among hijackings, which were already uncommon. Story 6. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency had actually shared intelligence, and if President Bush had acted on the presidential daily briefing, he received an August 2001 warning that Osama bin Laden was determined to strike in the United States and had followed Israeli intelligence reports naming the 19 hijackers and warnings about foreign students who were interested only in flying planes but not in landing or taking off, the outcome might have been different. The warning signs were there, but the lack of communication caused great harm. Story 7. Mark Wahlberg could have been on the plane. Story 8. The federal authorities could have acted on tips from the flight schools the hijackers attended. If I recall correctly, the schools called in a tip because one of the students was not very concerned with learning takeoffs or landings. That was suspicious because those are two very important parts of flying. Story 9. I think better intelligence sharing, stronger airport security, improved immigration controls, and quicker responses to threats might have stopped or reduced the impact of the September 11th attacks. Story 10. I think that if the United States of America did not have a pattern of overthrowing governments in the Middle East, it would never have happened. Story 11. Delays or cancellations to those airplanes would force Al-Qaeda to postpone the plot for at least several days. Such a delay dramatically increases the risk of exposure because it requires rescheduling every detail. This makes it more likely that at least one group member will suspect something is wrong and could lead to internal conflicts or contact with authorities. Story 12. If only Mark Wahlberg had been on those flights, he could have saved us. Story 13. Bin Laden determined to strike in the United States is a president's daily brief prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency that was delivered to President George W. Bush on Monday, August 6, 2001. The brief warned, 36 days before the September 11th attacks, of terrorism threats from Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, including patterns of suspicious activity in the United States consistent with preparations for a hijacking of United States aircraft. President Bush's response of "all right, you've covered your ass" has been erroneously linked to this president's daily brief. That response, however, came from a separate president's daily brief linked to bin Laden from several months earlier. During 2001, Central Intelligence Agency analysts produced several reports warning of imminent attacks by Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Senior officials, including Vice President Dick Cheney and staff from Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's office, questioned whether these reports might be deception by Al-Qaeda, designed to cause unnecessary expenditure of resources. After reevaluating the risks, Central Intelligence Agency analysts produced a report titled "Osama bin Laden Threats Are Real." It was after this report that the president gave that response. In short, the president and his senior advisors explicitly chose to dismiss and ignore reports from the Central Intelligence Agency stating that Osama bin Laden was developing the ability to carry out attacks on the United States using aircraft hijacking. Had they not done so, they could have directed intelligence gathering or investigative operations to identify the terrorists and prevent the attacks. Story 14. It is funny how many comments avoid American imperialism. It reminds me of a video I saw in which someone was outraged that a foreign military Qatar was opening a base on United States soil. The lack of self-awareness is astounding. Story 15. Better airport security, clearer intelligence sharing, stricter visa checks, faster action on warnings from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency, and tighter cockpit doors. Story 16. Minoru Yamasaki designed the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in the 1960s. He could have simply chosen not to. Story 17. I think the root cause that could have avoided all this is United States foreign policy in the Middle East. We preach self-determination, yet we meddled in Iran and installed the Shah. We also chose to support Israel when we could have been more supportive of the Palestinians. Our vote in the United Nations has prevented them from achieving genuine statehood. Since we were once a colony of England, we should have been more supportive of Palestine rather than the Zionist colonizers. All the wars we conducted on behalf of Israel in that region damaged our image with Arabs. If the shoe were on the other foot, we would not have a favorable opinion of the United States. In short, I think the attacks of September 11, 2001 were blowback from decades of poor foreign policy. You can search for the documented Central Intelligence Agency operation to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, which contributed to the hostage crisis in the late 1970s. For what it is worth, I was at the World Trade Center subway station on the morning of September 11, 2001 when the first plane hit, so I am not just an outsider with a random opinion. Story 18. If the United States had not stationed troops in Saudi Arabia on Islam's holiest sites after the Gulf War ended in 1991, and if it had not supported Israel in its brutal mistreatment of Palestinians, the outcome would be different. This is well known. Americans should talk about it more. Story 19. It probably would have prevented Bush and Cheney from stealing the election. It would have done wonders. I am sorry. I do not pretend to know what happened on September 11th. I only know that their story is nonsense. Story 20. Discussion. Were there factors in place that could have prevented the attacks, and how might that have changed the course of the day? For example, one or more of the hijackers being arrested. If a few hijackers had raised suspicions and were arrested at their departure airports, would the other hijackings have occurred, or would the plot have failed? Weather. Something outside the control of the hijackers. If conditions had been terrible, for example a severe thunderstorm or dense fog, would they have carried out the attacks hoping they could still see their intended targets? Essentially, was September 11, 2001 planned so well that, if something dramatic had gone wrong, the group could have reorganized for another time, or would they have abandoned the plan entirely? Story 21. Our intelligence agencies were cooperating as Americans believed. All the pieces were there. We were just looking at them separately. Story 22. Almost all major terrorist attacks are intelligence failures, and in most cases it is inaction rather than a lack of intelligence. Story 23. In my opinion, when the report titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States was written, it should have been obvious that United States airports were soft targets. Armed security should have been placed in all major airports, both in uniform and plain clothes. This should have been done. Instead, they did nothing. Story 24. Read about Billy Waugh. He was in a position to capture Osama bin Laden years earlier, but his request to take action reached President Bill Clinton, who declined to authorize an operation. Story 25. Before September 11, 2001, nearly every aircraft hijacking ended with the plane landing and negotiations over demands such as the release of prisoners. If passengers had believed another outcome was possible, they likely would have stopped the hijackers before they gained control of the aircraft. Story 26. There are longer lines, and shoes must be removed at the Transportation Security Administration. Also bring real identification. Story 27. The United States should refrain from involving itself in police actions in the Middle East, from murdering hundreds of thousands of civilians, and from funding groups that would become terrorist organizations under the rationale that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It should not fund the bids for power by religious extremists. But then our 1% would be slightly less rich and would have slightly less power. Story 28. September 11, 2001 was always going to happen. It was the perfect way to start wars, take away freedoms, and establish the framework for a surveillance state. Story 29. Al Gore was elected president, representing a continuation of the Clinton administration's intelligence policies. Story 30. The government knew a terrorist attack was likely and would involve planes. They should have taken that more seriously. Story 31. Laser dinosaurs. We'd be too busy hiding in caves to build towers and airplanes. Story 32. If only we had thrown away more people's liquid toiletries over 3.4 ounces. Story 33. If bin Laden had not been expelled after the Cold War, he would have been on the Central Intelligence Agency payroll to help attack the Russians. If Bill Clinton had killed him when he had the chance, I think that would only have delayed things. Story 34. If the Pentagon did not need a new Pearl Harbor-level event to justify its defense spending, September 11, 2001 probably would not have happened. Story 35. Surely if an alpha male podcaster had been on board, he could have prevented it. Story 36. George W. Bush's election enraged Osama bin Laden, who still held a grudge against George H. W. Bush for the Gulf War and for the presence of military bases in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It is not a coincidence that the September 11th attacks occurred shortly after Bush's election. Story 37. Even if peace existed everywhere, nuclear fallout would still be closer than that. There will always be people who hate. Story 38. Don't downvote me, but what are your thoughts? Is it an insider job? An orchestrated attack to open the gates of hell? Story 39. Central Intelligence Agency to Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sorry, I do not know how to post my graphics interchange format image. Story 40. Mark Wahlberg would have stopped it. It would have gone down differently if he were on the plane. Story 41. A functioning intelligence apparatus that employed qualified people. Story 42. Agencies should actually share information instead of posturing and being too self-important at the expense of the safety and security of the American people. Those in charge should not have punished or pushed out agents who had sounded the alarms after the attack on the United States ship Cole. United States foreign policy should finally understand that our meddling has consequences that return decades later. We cannot create a culture similar to that of the United States in parts of the world where we do not understand the history or culture, nor do we consider the impacts of our actions when we create civil war or a power vacuum. Story 43. 1. Do not suspend the terrorism task force simply because it has Clinton's name on it. 2. Read the August 6th presidential daily briefing for comprehension. Story 44. A cold front did not come in. Hurricane Aaron was on the way, and if the cold front that produced the clear blue skies that morning had not arrived as quickly, flights might not have been able to land or could have been significantly delayed. Story 45. Had the United States become serious about national security after the Oklahoma City bombing, the hijackers would not have been able to enter the country through Canada. Story 46. Allowing Billy Waugh to assassinate Osama bin Laden in Sudan before bin Laden facilitated the embassy bombings and the September 11th attacks. Story 47. They knew a major attack was coming from intercepted communications. Intelligence agencies were asking each other for help, but no one knew what form it would take. Story 48. I do not know. Maybe if the United States had just let the countries in the Middle East resolve their own problems. Story 49. This post somehow attracted defenders of Osama bin Laden. I did not know this was actually a thing. The fact that people are downvoting this comment is astonishing. What on earth has happened to this world? Story 50. All of these comments are nonsense. Only one thing was needed to stop the attacks on September 11, 2001. Strict security screening. If knives and pepper spray had not been allowed on board, there would not have been a group of people threatening passengers and crew with such weapons. Story 51. The United States was not trying to control Middle Eastern oil for most of the 20th century. Story 52. We have not meddled in Middle East politics for the last 70 years. Story 53. Bush not being elected and improved airport security. I think someone in the Federal Bureau of Investigation knew they were planning it in Kuala Lumpur, but they ignored him because he was Arab. Story 54. Bush and the Project for a New American Century did not win the election in 2000. Story 55. It would have been a good start for the United States to leave other countries alone. they still have the gall to complain. Story 56. The United States of America is keeping its interference out of other countries' business. Story 57. If it had happened on April 1st, the hijackers would have thought it was just an April Fool's prank set up by bin Laden. Story 58. If Mark Wahlberg had been on the plane, he would have stopped it. Source: Mark Wahlberg. Story 59. They could not have placed the explosives inside the tower. Story 60. Condoleezza Rice was doing her job. She failed the nation immensely. Story 61. The Clinton administration warned the Bush administration during the transfer of power. It is up to you to determine why that warning was ignored. Story 62. Apparently, if Obama were in office, he would not be picking out tan suits. Story 63. If the United States actually had some fucking empathy and did not want to buy its way into any wars, look where we are now. Story 64. The September 11, 2001 attacks were allowed to happen, enabling passage of the Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism act. That was when American democracy died. Story 65. Maybe there is some truth to it. Listen to the words spoken in the helicopter scene. Story 66. If the British had won, that could have hampered the September 11th attacks somewhat. Story 67. Sailboats over jetliners. Although the cruise ship did a lot of damage in Speed 2, unfortunately, Sandra Bullock is not Keanu Reeves. How many times has Keanu saved the world anyway? That man is a national treasure, just like Nicolas Cage. Namaste for now. Memento mori. Carpe noctem. Story 68. If the Central Intelligence Agency had given Federal Bureau of Investigation agent Ali Sofan the names of two hijackers from a Malaysian meeting of al-Qaeda members, Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, Sofan could have at least disrupted the hijacking of Flight 77 and perhaps found other members. If the flight school had notified the Federal Bureau of Investigation that Mohammed Atta and Marwan al-Shayhi were learning to fly but showed no interest in landing, that could have disrupted the hijackings of Flights 11 and 175. Story 69. I am pretty sure the September 11th attacks would not have happened if they had occurred on August 11th instead. Story 70. Someone could use the idea of flying an airliner into a high-value target. Something like the September 11th attacks was a black swan event. Nothing like it had ever been fathomed as possible or successful. No one on the ground or on the airliner realized what the plan was or could have stopped it until it was too late. Today, that is the first assumption for any flight hijacking over the continental United States or elsewhere. Those on the ground will know to ground the plane at any cost as soon as possible, and those on the plane will fight for their lives instead of waiting for their demise. The Transportation Security Administration is a bloated, ineffective, government-subsidized busywork jobs program and has been from day one. Story 71. If only the fucking tetrapods had stayed in the water. Story 72. If Pete Hegseth listened to Donald Trump about Osama bin Laden. Story 73. I read something about a Central Intelligence Agency agent who was stationed in Africa to monitor several Saudi nationals suspected of being part of a terrorist group. He had served in special operations in Vietnam and was highly intimidating. He had several options to neutralize those individuals, and repeatedly asked his superiors for authorization because they were certain the group was planning an attack on the United States. One of those men was Osama bin Laden. He came within a car's width of him and later said he could have killed Osama bin Laden many times if he had received authorization. He was furious when the attacks of September 11, 2001 happened, and he felt he could have stopped them. Story 74. Britain is not drawing borders with a ruler in the Near East. Story 75. A side effect of this is the project for the new American century. Story 76. Time Machine, 1953. The Secret Intelligence Service and the Central Intelligence Agency do not overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. Iran becomes an independently wealthy, secular anchor state in the region, leading to a sharp reduction of Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. Story 77. The United States not being an imperialist war machine that undermines and topples other countries' governments in order to steal their natural resources. Story 78. A lot of people point the finger at United States foreign policy in the Middle East, and that bears significant responsibility. I think the term blowback originated in a Central Intelligence Agency communique about how the United States might experience blowback for overthrowing the Iranian government and installing the Shah. But the United States is also a place of individualism, consumerism, and capitalism, and Islamist philosophers such as Syed Qutb saw the United States as a society obsessed with sex and violence. He criticized the Muslim world but also the United States for exporting these ideas. So you cannot ignore Islamism as a factor. In my opinion, even if the United States had never supported Israel or sent a soldier to the Middle East, it is a fantasy to think that Islamists would leave the United States alone. That is not realistic given how strongly Islamists call for jihad against the West, and the United States is seen as the leader of Western nations and ideals. The hierarchy of failure starts macro and goes micro. 1. United States meddling in the affairs of the Middle East. Decades of supporting coups or propping up dictators fuel resentment and a desire to strike back asymmetrically. 2. Not prioritizing reform of how law enforcement and national security agencies coordinate to deal with terror cells and leaders, particularly around intelligence. 3. This failure to reform led to real intelligence failures, as no one could or would coordinate the information they had been given about the 19 hijackers. 4. If these individuals were on various agencies' radars, why could they not be flagged as security risks prior to entering the country? 5. Poor airport security screening. This remains the biggest failure of the whole incident. It could have been stopped that day if box cutters had not been allowed in carry-on luggage. 6. Cockpit doors. If the attackers had not been able to force the cockpit doors open, they would not have crashed the planes. Story 79. History has shown that evildoers often catch people sleeping. It takes a bit of cold water before they become vigilant again. Story 80. You should watch the looming tower. It is really incredible. Story 81. If Chuck Norris had not farted, we would not have had the Big Bang. Story 82. If early warnings about Al-Qaeda had been taken seriously and airport security had been stricter. Story 83. If the force of gravity were a tenth of what it is, the jumpers would have been called wafters. Story 84. A person who used Reddit's option to return to the age of 6 with their current knowledge and shorted stocks so aggressively that George W. Bush had to call it off. Story 85. There were security doors to the cockpit. Passengers might have died, but they would not have been able to enter it. Story 86. George W. Bush received dozens of presidential daily briefs about the threat of Al-Qaeda. The problem with the briefs was that they were not coherent. They conveyed urgency but also downplayed the validity of the intelligence. If you are an intelligence consumer, that does not convey a message that something must be done immediately. This was an intelligence failure not because there was no warning, but because the Central Intelligence Agency had a collective failure of imagination. Previous hijackings did not involve attackers using planes as missiles. They typically involved hostage situations. I believe the Central Intelligence Agency expected a similar pattern. There was also clear fatigue on the part of President Bush about the nature and urgency of the threat due to both the high volume of briefs and poor reporting from the Central Intelligence Agency. The Central Intelligence Agency is not in a policymaking role, and because of its aversion to using language that suggests policy, it crafted wording in the presidential daily briefs that was not actionable. Something is going to happen soon, but we do not know what it is, and the information may be unreliable. Imagine you are a new president with no foreign policy experience. What would you do with that? I had a 3-hour graduate class in which we examined the August 2001 brief with former presidential daily brief writers teaching the class. We spent 3 hours tearing the report apart and discussing how we would have worded things differently. There have been many reforms to improve reporting and communication. I will say that the Department of Homeland Security did little to improve communication or collaboration. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created to better coordinate intelligence, but it has limited authority. The Director of National Intelligence has implemented directives to improve intelligence analysis and reporting. Story 87. History of the Middle East is complex, but here is a simple answer. The borders of the Middle East are the source of much instability. The British and the French drew them to keep the area weak and exploitable. Although those colonial powers largely ended direct control after World War II, the borders remained and continued to create instability. If the area had been left intact after World War I, the September 11th attacks probably would not have occurred. Story 88. If it was not right after the end of summer break and the start of the school year, intelligence officials may have been more focused on their jobs. This appears to be a combination of a normal office cycle and the usual level of government incompetence. Story 89. A competent president would never have had the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency compare notes, nor would he have alerted the Federal Aviation Administration. Story 90. Pilots should also be black belts in Kung Fu. Software should prevent the plane from approaching buildings or flying at unsafe altitudes. A trapdoor near the cockpit entrance could open if someone attempts to break in, dropping the intruder into a secure holding area. An additional cockpit door could require an assailant to face a trained animal, such as a tiger or bear, or pass through a wasp enclosure before reaching the main door. Story 91. Weather. The visibility that day was well over 100 kilometers. I often wonder when the decision was made to go on that date. Story 92. There is a comprehensive government inquiry and report. If you do not feel like reading it, there is a graphic adaptation titled The September 11th Report. Story 93. The hijackers did have a complicated plan that could have fallen apart if any of them were arrested or lost their nerve. Story 94. They were shouting from the rooftops that they were going to do this. We should have taken all the warnings and previous attacks seriously. It's another time you look back and think, what arrogant dumbassery. Story 95. I cannot help edit or repeat unverified allegations about a real person. I can help rephrase it neutrally, for example. Some people have suggested a connection between Larry Silverstein's purchase of the buildings and the events, or provide verified background information instead. Story 96. People now understand that if terrorists try to seize control of a plane, passengers should take any necessary action to stop them. Previously, people did not view the events of September 11th, 2001 as a realistic possibility, so pilots sometimes allowed hijackers into the cockpit, believing that was the option most likely to minimize loss of life. Story 97. All those psychics who saw it coming and refused to do anything about it. Story 98. Someone traveled back in time and assassinated Alicia Otis. Story 99. Global, species-wide recognition that money has value only if we choose to treat it as such. The rules that support money are made up. It is a big game, and if it causes anyone to suffer, it should be thrown off the table. Story 100. Combined, the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Central Intelligence Agency had all the information necessary to prevent the September 11, 2001 attacks. If the federal agencies had worked together, those attacks might have been prevented. Story 101. Consider what Osama bin Laden said in his speeches. He cited constant United States intervention in the Middle East and Africa as his motivation, particularly United States support for Israel and its growing alliance with Saudi Arabia, his home country, as well as other United States interventions in the region. Story 102. If the United States stopped interfering in so many countries, such as through invasions and overthrowing governments. Story 103. Agency cooperation and tighter enforcement of visa requirements, with an air marshal on each flight. Story 104. In this thread, Americans are showing that they learned absolutely nothing from what happened and mostly believe weak misconceptions and propaganda, such as the claim that they hated our freedoms, instead of actually listening to what Osama bin Laden had to say about it. Story 105. The United States could have stopped acting as the world's police and focused on domestic security. Story 106. If the United States had not been repeatedly involved in the Middle East, it would have kept us separate from those issues. Story 107. Recommend watching Charlie Wilson's War. We fucked up the endgame. Story 108. Condoleezza Rice was given a warning by the intelligence community and she did nothing. Had she acted, it might have been averted. Story 109. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Federal Bureau of Investigation could have stopped it if they had shared their combined intelligence. Story 110. Are these the same things being allowed to happen right now? People are being radicalized. The United States is complicit in arms deals and in supporting sides in the Middle East. That is why I was flabbergasted when they announced training fighter pilots from Qatar on United States soil. Story 111. I am telling you, I flew across the United States a month earlier and my parents flew to Europe. We both said the same thing after September 11, 2001. They searched everyone very thoroughly. They had to know something was going to happen. Story 112. I am built differently. I would have chugged a Monster energy drink and thrown those terrorists out of the plane. Story 113. Do you still believe it was done by some Al-Qaeda or Bin Laden terrorist group? There is enough evidence available for those who want to learn. Story 114. Jet fuel can't get hot enough to melt steel beams encased in both a fireproof coating and concrete. I've worked in concrete, steel, and the aviation industry. The numbers just don't add up. Story 115. While there is oil in the Middle East, there will always be Western meddling. Story 116. Clinton took out Osama bin Laden when he had the chance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation acted on the tips they were given. Story 117. If the carving up of the Ottoman Empire had not coincided with the oil age. Story 118. The operation was carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency in collaboration with the Mossad. If they had ended their reliance on supporting wars for foreign nations such as Israel, it could have been prevented. Story 119. A closer inspection of the 3 years of structural improvements to the elevator shafts could reveal exactly what was done and which materials were added. Story 120. Early identification of extremist networks and their financing can prevent attacks by cutting off resources. Story 121. No short selling of stocks is allowed. Who bought the put options on airline stocks a few days earlier? Story 122. If the Republican Party had not been so arrogant and incompetent, creating Al-Qaeda in the first place, antagonizing radical Islamists while simultaneously helping to subvert democratic movements in countries with Muslim majorities, and ignoring the warnings the Clinton administration laid out for President George W. Bush and dismantling the entire counterterrorism apparatus the United States had in place in the months leading up to September 11, 2001. Story 123. If George Bush had heeded the concerns raised to him and stepped up security at certain airports, that would have done it. Story 124. There were more domestic terror attacks on United States soil in the 1990s, which made the threat a greater concern for United States intelligence. Story 125. Sorry, I can't access or edit content directly from that link. If you paste the text here, I will correct spelling, expand acronyms, remove repetition and special characters, and format it for Azure text-to-speech. Alternatively, I can provide a concise summary of the Wikipedia article instead. Which would you prefer? Story 126. If they had added secure doors to planes after the hijackings in the late 1960s. Story 127. Not supporting extremist groups in the Middle East to destabilize governments that were blocking your imperialist campaign in the region would have prevented an entire generation of children born in the ashes of war from seeking revenge and being indoctrinated by the warlords and zealots you helped rise to power. That would have done it. Story 128. If the United States had simply sat back, not funded anyone, and done nothing when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda and other jihadist groups would not have grown as large as they did. Story 129. Overthrowing the system. If everyone collectively decided that dollars were a fictitious value, those planes would not fly. Story 130. If intelligence agencies had shared intelligence, many had only bits and pieces. At that time, each department was reluctant to share with others. Story 131. If you could go back in time and activate the fire alarm, most of them would be forced to leave the building, assuming they had fire drills as strict as those today. Story 132. Donald Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice ignored intelligence presented to them by multiple agencies. When Ahmad Shah Massoud was killed 2 days before September 11th, even Vladimir Putin called President George W. Bush to say that something big was afoot. Story 133. If the United States were isolationist and did not meddle in the Middle East. Story 134. If Gore had fought in the Supreme Court, as he should have, he would have implemented the Clinton administration's recommendations and provided better oversight of terrorists. Story 135. Refuting capitalism that is fueled by a war economy. Avoiding the displacement of generations of people in the pursuit of power. Promoting communal wealth without extracting it from places you have never been. Story 136. They are actually acting on the reports that said it was going to happen. This country has a bad habit of not being preemptive. Story 137. George Bush was not ignoring the memo titled Bin Laden Determined to Attack in the United States, issued 6 months before the attack. This may have helped. Story 138. Al Gore won, but the election was rigged and George W. Bush was put in power. Story 139. Demand for oil persists, and Saudi Arabia supplies it. Money changes hands. The world turns a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's version of religious fundamentalism, which gives rise to groups such as Al-Qaeda. Story 140. If George Walker Bush had taken his job as president seriously instead of playing golf, events might have turned out differently. Story 141. The truth most people do not want to face is that there is only one major religion that has not moderated over the centuries. Judaism began its moderation hundreds of years ago with the elimination of the Sanhedrin and other institutions. Christianity began its moderation with Martin Luther about 900 years ago, among other factors. Buddhism never really needed to be reformed, as its founder was largely in meditation. Hinduism is similar, with many gods and none that are warlike in any way. That brings us to Islam. It continues much as it did in the 7th century. While the majority who follow Muhammad are peace-loving people, a hardcore faction believes it is their duty to carry out their goals exactly as Muhammad did, especially during the last 10 or so years of his life. He spread Islam by the sword, conquering much of modern-day Saudi Arabia, with forced conversions and the taking of slaves, including sexual slavery, essentially spreading the message convert or die. Until this changes, more attacks like the September 11th attacks are likely. Story 142. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation had paid attention to its field offices about people interested only in landing planes. Story 143. If John McCain had won the South Carolina Republican primary, I donated $100 to his campaign at that time. Bush and his team used dirty tactics and made robocalls and other attacks about McCain's adopted black son. Story 144. Our nation has many very powerful people who hold no elected office, yet they own and control most of the District of Columbia and the intelligence agencies. Clearly 9/11 was known about prior to the attack. It appears demolition charges were used to bring down buildings, and our government lied to us and continues to lie about it. 99.9% of people can do nothing about this reality, and most are too busy with their own lives to be involved. Anyone who tries is said to die by suicide from multiple stab wounds, from shotgun fire across the room, or from poisoned coffee at Starbucks. A prominent example is the reported string of suspicious deaths of people who had any knowledge of alleged wrongdoing by the Clintons. Big corporations do it too. Whistleblowers die all the time and nobody seems to notice. So how can we get free of this system? I do not know. Story 145. If the United States had not spent decades intervening in the Middle East and toppling democratically elected leaders, people there might not resent us for our actions. They would prefer that we had not interfered. Story 146. Christopher Columbus decided not to try to find an alternative route to Asia. Story 147. The administration in charge did not want an excuse to start a war in Iraq. Story 148. American imperialism caused this, so it must end. Story 149. Mark Wahlberg, apparently. Story 150. I think it was likely inevitable. The September 11th attacks may not have unfolded in exactly the same way, but the motivations that led to them had been simmering for many years. If you want to learn more, a great podcast series is Blind Spot: Road to September 11th. There are many layers to what led to the September 11th attacks, so there is no single easy solution. Story 151. Clinton tried to kill ABL but missed. Story 152. The decision to elect Al Gore in 2000 was affected by George H. W. Bush, James A. Baker, and others who had a lot of dirty bonds to cash that they created in 1991 to bury the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Magico presto. All bonds were cleared, no questions asked, for 2 weeks. It was the greatest crime of the century. Story 153. I was only 6 at the time. I could have stopped it with low difficulty. Story 154. The United States should stay the fuck out of the internal affairs of sovereign nations. Story 155. President Clinton had an opportunity to apprehend Osama bin Laden. Story 156. The United States is focusing on domestic issues instead of acting as the world's police. Story 157. It would probably have helped if the 2000 election had not taken 5 to 6 weeks to be decided. President Bush did not receive intelligence briefings until December. Story 158. There was no serious tag. Mount some anti-aircraft guns on top of skyscrapers. Story 159. I was born in 1996, so I do not remember much before it happened. For as long as I can remember, airports have had extensive security. When my parents told me they did not have to go through all the security lines, I thought it was crazy and could not imagine a time without it. Story 160. The absence of greed and of powerful people seeking greater influence. Story 161. The United States lobbies were not afraid of workers wanting their rights back, which meant they would not be afraid of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This meant they would not invade, intervene, or funnel money and resources to their allies. It would have meant they would not need to fight in the Middle East against Soviet influence, avoiding instability and the growth of extremist groups that ultimately led to the attacks. Story 162. Foreign policy that did not make enemies in the Middle East. Story 163. President Bill Clinton could have taken out Osama bin Laden in the 1990s but did not. Story 164. Had the United States found a different solution instead of stationing troops in Saudi Arabia, that might have been enough. One should also consider relations with Iran and Iraq before that. If the United States had not supported the Shah, Iran might not have become an Islamic state. If the United States had not armed Iraq so heavily, it might not have started invading other countries. Greater support for Iran at certain times might also have deterred Iraq from invading Kuwait. Overall, meddling in the Middle East backfired, and the United States escalated its involvement. What could go wrong? Story 165. Authorities could have banned box cutters from airplane cabins and preemptively secured cabin doors, making them impossible to breach and mandating they be locked as soon as the aircraft pushed back from the gate. Both measures would likely have prevented hijackers from gaining control of the aircraft and probably would have made the attack infeasible during the planning stage. Story 166. It probably would have worked out differently if the Central Intelligence Agency had not been trying to recruit terrorists as assets and had not facilitated bringing some of them here. Story 167. Had the United States left the Arabian Peninsula after the liberation of Kuwait in 1991, instead of building permanent bases there, the September 11th attacks probably would not have occurred. The motivation for the September 11th attacks and the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center was the presence of United States military forces on the Arabian Peninsula. Al-Qaeda and many other Muslims considered it sacrilegious to have those forces on their holy lands. Story 168. The United States of America and the Central Intelligence Agency not overthrowing democratically elected moderate governments in the Middle East would have worked out pretty well. Story 169. We are not arming Wahhabi Mujahideen to fight Russia as our proxies in Afghanistan. Who are we arming as proxies in Ukraine? Story 170. Was the closed-circuit television footage from the Department of Transportation covering the interstate or nearby buildings ever released? Story 171. Bush and the Republicans were paying attention to the presidential daily briefing titled, Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the United States. Story 172. I do not know. Did someone try to blow it up the first time with a van? Story 173. Bush administration officials allowed foreigners who were on a watch list to obtain pilots' licenses within the first few months after they traveled to the United States of America. The Central Intelligence Agency agent who paid for one of the hijackers' apartments in California seemed unusual. It would be useful if the 5 Israelis who were reportedly dancing on top of their van when the towers were hit released the film they recorded leading up to the initial impact. The additional vantage point would be helpful, and if they had informed local authorities about the impending attack, that would have been beneficial. Story 174. Maybe if the buildings hadn't been rigged with explosives? Story 175. Let us just say that sometimes they allow bad things to happen because it will help with the bigger picture. Story 176. Didn't Donald Trump claim responsibility? He said that he told Hegseth about it. Story 177. Whether or not the United States armed jihadists in Afghanistan for a decade, the United States and the European Union are supporting the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham leader in Syria as a clean slate president. Let us hope he is not a new Osama bin Laden and that no new September 11th attacks occur as a result. Story 178. The United States could have packed up and left Saudi Arabia. This was the source of Osama bin Laden's entire grievance with the United States. Saudi Arabia was an ally of the United States, with a strong military presence in the region. It did not need United States bases there. United States forces had only come for the Gulf War, and after that conflict they remained in what many Muslims regard as the sacred land of the Prophet Muhammad. To a religious man like Osama bin Laden, that was an affront to his country and his faith. He was also very proud, believing he had defeated the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics with substantial help from the United States, so he thought he could confront the United States and expect a similar result. Story 179. What if Americans had not controlled the demolition of the Twin Towers? Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.